If you've ever stepped into a century-old farmhouse, a stone cottage, or a pre-war timber home and noticed how it feels dry, stable, and breathable even after decades of hard weather, you're noticing something modern construction quietly abandoned. These homes weren't magic, they weren't lucky. They followed physical rules that builders once understood deeply and applied consistently. Moisture management was not a system added later. It was embedded into every material choice and construction decision from the ground up. What follows is not nostalgia. It is a technical explanation of why old homes stayed dry, healthy, and structurally sound, while many modern houses rot from the inside out within a generation. Old homes allowed moisture to move instead of trying to imprison it. Traditional buildings were designed with the understanding that moisture will always exist. Rain happens, ground moisture rises, people breathe, cook, wash, and heat their homes. Instead of fighting moisture with barriers and seals, older construction allowed moisture to move freely and escape before it could accumulate. Walls were permeable, floors were ventilated, roofs breathed. Nothing was designed to be airtight because builders knew airtightness without controlled drying creates decay. When moisture entered an old home, it did not become trapped in a sealed cavity. It migrated outward, evaporated, and left the structure naturally. You can apply this today by prioritizing vapor-open materials when repairing or retrofitting older homes, lime plaster instead of gypsum, breathable insulation like wood fiber or mineral wool instead of foam, and, it's important to avoid sandwiching historic walls between impermeable layers that stop drying in both directions. Natural materials absorbed and released moisture without damage. Old homes relied on hygroscopic materials, substances that can absorb moisture from the air and release it later without losing strength. Wood, lime, clay, stone, and brick all buffer humidity naturally. When indoor moisture rose, these materials absorbed it. When the air dried, they released it. This buffering effect stabilized indoor humidity levels long before mechanical systems existed. It reduced condensation on surfaces and prevented mold from gaining a foothold. Modern materials like drywall, synthetic insulation, and plastic vapor barriers do not buffer moisture. They trap it at interfaces where it condenses silently and feeds decay. A practical application today is using lime wash or clay plaster on interior walls in humid rooms. These finishes actively regulate moisture instead of sealing it behind paint and plastic. Thick walls created thermal mass that controlled condensation. Old homes were built with thick walls, often 12 to 24 inches deep. These walls provided thermal mass, meaning they changed temperature slowly. This mattered enormously for moisture control. When indoor air hit a cold surface, condensation formed. But thick masonry walls stayed closer to indoor temperature, dramatically reducing surface condensation. Modern thin walls with high insulation values but low mass create sharp temperature gradients. Warm indoor air hits a cold sheathing layer inside the wall cavity, condenses, and stays there. The homeowner never sees it, but rot and mold begin immediately. For modern builders or renovators, this principle can be applied by adding internal thermal mass through masonry features, earthen floors, or dense plaster layers, rather than relying entirely on lightweight insulation systems. Raised floors and ventilated crawl spaces stop ground moisture cold. Old homes rarely sat directly on sealed concrete slabs. Floors were raised above the ground with open airflow beneath them. This allowed ground moisture to evaporate safely into the open air instead of being forced upward into the living space. Modern slab-on-grade construction traps moisture beneath impermeable concrete. Vapor pressure pushes it upward, and it ends up inside walls, flooring systems, and insulation. Builders respond with plastic barriers, but once those fail or are punctured, moisture has nowhere to go. Now, if you live in a damp climate, elevating your floors or making sure you've got active underfloor ventilation Well, that's still one of the most effective ways to control moisture that's out there. Roofs, were actually designed to vent heat and moisture naturally. Old roofs leaked air on purpose, not water, but air. Warm, moist air would rise and exit through gaps, vents, and loosely fitted materials. This kind of setup prevented condensation inside roof structures and dried out any moisture that got in there pretty quickly. These days, modern roofs are sealed up tight to boost energy efficiency, but without perfect vapor control and mechanical ventilation, they can end up trapping moisture in attics and roof cavities. That's when rot begins up at the ridge, mold spreads where you can't see it, and your insulation just stops working like it should. A practical takeaway, y'all, is making sure that modern roofs have reliable ventilation paths. And, it's best to avoid spray foam in roof cavities unless you really understand and can control how moisture moves in there. Windows and doors used to leak just enough to keep air moving. Old windows weren't airtight, and honestly, that was intentional. Those small amounts of air leakage kept a constant exchange going, which helped prevent stagnant humidity from building up indoors. This slow, steady ventilation kept moisture levels balanced all year long. With modern, airtight construction, you gotta have mechanical ventilation to do what old buildings used to handle passively. And when that system fails, or maybe it's too small or not looked after, well, moisture can start to build up real fast. For modern homeowners, even controlled passive ventilation strategies like trickle vents or seasonally adjustable airflow can really make a big difference. These approaches can dramatically reduce moisture issues without sacrificing comfort. Traditional heating relied on wood, coal, or masonry stoves that produced radiant heat. These systems warmed surfaces and walls, not just the air. Warm surfaces reduced condensation risk and actively dried the structure over time. Modern forced air heating warms air quickly but leaves walls cold, especially exterior walls. When warm, moist air meets those cold surfaces, condensation forms behind finishes. Now, incorporating radiant heating elements or masonry heaters can, really replicate this drying effect and help protect building materials for the long haul. Old homes, well, they were maintained with compatible materials. Lime mortar was repaired with lime. Wood was allowed to expand and contract, just as it should. Repairs worked with the building instead of, against it. These days, modern renovations often introduce cement, foam, and synthetic membranes into old structures, locking moisture inside materials that were never meant to be sealed. Damage follows quickly, and folks tend to blame the building instead of the repair method. If you own an older home, using historically appropriate materials is not just an aesthetic preference, it's structural preservation. So, what does all this mean for survival-minded builders and homeowners today? Well, moisture failure is, silent, slow, and just downright devastating. In grid-down or long-term survival scenarios, a structure that self-regulates moisture without relying on mechanical systems becomes, honestly, invaluable. Those old building principles offer a kind of resilience that modern construction often just plain lacks. Applying these principles today means choosing permeability over plastic mass, over lightness, drying paths over barriers, and, simplicity over complexity. These aren't outdated ideas, not by a long shot. They're just proven physics. Homes built this way, they last longer, need less intervention, and most importantly, stay habitable even when modern systems fail. If this kind of grounded, practical history matters to you, make sure you subscribe to Warfield Prepper Chronicles. And hey, share this guide with anyone restoring an old home, building off-grid, or who's serious about long-term resilience. This knowledge survives, folks, because it's passed on.